Middle Way Philosophy, Introductory Video 5D, Even-handedness, Balanced Clarity in Practical Judgment, by Robert M. Ellis. This is a tributary video to video number 5 in this series on agnosticism. The middle way is a principle of judgment, which involves avoiding the absolutes, the extremes on either side. But how can we actually maintain that balance? What we might call the practice of even-handedness. It's a difficult practice. There are many pitfalls involved. This video tries to go into some of those pitfalls and provide some further principles by which even-handedness can be found. Here are some of the common confusions or pitfalls that tend to occur when people try to practice the middle way. First, the extremes in the middle way are very often only judged conventionally, as though they were just a matter of a particular context or a particular society, what they find extreme, rather than what is extreme in a wider sense. Often, prior metaphysical assumptions are allowed to dictate the terms of the middle way, but of course then the middle way just becomes another metaphysics. Sometimes there's a tilt towards one side as preferable to the other. That again, it's incompatible with even-handedness. And sometimes the middle way is expected to provide absolute answers, but of course it does not. It guides us in the right sort of direction. So let's think further about how we can avoid these sorts of confusions. Let's think about some more positive principles that we might draw on. I have 4 principles of even-handed judgment to suggest here. The first of those principles is, firstly, identify clear extremes of belief. It's beliefs that we're looking for that make up the extremes. A belief should not be confused with a feeling to start with. Somebody might have a strong feeling of disgust or a strong feeling of anger, but that doesn't necessarily mean that what they're reacting to is a kind of belief that is the extreme we're trying to avoid in the middle way. It's quite possible that something that disgusts you to start with is only a result of an unbalanced reaction of some kind that you need to reconsider in order to find the middle way. A belief should also not be confused with a convention or a practice or a custom in a certain group. For example, in Britain or America, it's polite to shake hands and smile at them when you meet somebody. It's impolite to belch. That doesn't mean necessarily that belching is an extreme thing to do. In order to clarify the extremes of belief that we're avoiding, we also often need to clarify the terminology. There may be certain terms that people make use of. For example, a term like scientific, say. People often assume that a term of this kind either indicates something that's necessarily good and thus moderate, or on the other hand, that it's necessarily extreme. Perhaps those who are very supportive of science or practice it may believe that something that's scientific is necessarily the middle way. On the other hand, those who reject science for whatever reason, perhaps coming from a religious background, may assume that something scientific is necessarily extreme. Neither of those apply. You have to look beyond that label. Think about what is actually being claimed and how it's being justified. Similar issues apply to a whole string of other possible terms. Artistic, natural, religious, atheist, conservative, fair, Christian, Buddhist, Islamic, socialist, liberal, political, feminist. Perhaps some of those terms press your buttons. Look out for those particularly. If you're very likely to assume that a term, or some kind of claim where that term is included, is necessarily extreme, then look a bit further. That isn't necessarily the case. Very often the use of these terms is vague or ambiguous. Very often it just shows that they come from a particular tradition, rather than that they're justified in a particular way. After we've identified clear extremes of belief, my second principle is that we should check that these beliefs are absolute opposites. The quickest and easiest way to differentiate whether a claim is absolute is that it's non-incremental. That is, it can't be restated as a matter of degree. Here's an example. Women can't read maps. This appears to be an absolute statement because it seems to be talking about all women, not just some women or women some of the time. It also seems to be talking about women's ability to read maps in an absolute way. Not that they can read maps to some extent and not to some other extent. It's an absolute statement, although of course that's where we're interpreting it in the abstract, and if you had somebody making that statement in a real context, you could question them further to find out what they really meant. Perhaps you could interpret what they said more charitably. A non-absolute version of the similar sort of statement would be something like this. On average, women have more difficulty with complex spatial tasks than men. That's an incremental statement. It also fits the evidence much better than the blanket generalization in the first statement. Absolute claims tend to fall easily into opposites, which are negations of each other. However, we need to make sure, if we're going to be clear about the extremes we're avoiding, that they are indeed negations of each other and not simply alternatives which only slightly appear to be opposed or are only incidentally opposed. To look at the example we considered previously, the opposite of women can't read maps would be women can read maps. Another example, the cuts to disability benefits are fair. The negation of that is the cuts to disability benefits are unfair. The following examples, however, are not opposites and illustrate some of the kinds of confusions we can fall into here. Billionaires rule the world is not negated by the United Nations rules the world. These are just alternative groups that rule the world. The opposite of billionaires rule the world will be billionaires do not rule the world, not an alternative. An even closer, more dangerously prone to confusion example. Everyone should be a vegan is not negated by everyone should be a meat eater. In practice, of course, people who made these two opposing claims would probably disagree about a great deal. However, they're not clear negations of each other. They are alternative modes of dietary habit. My third principle of even-handed judgment is treat both extremes as equally unhelpful. If you get to this stage and you feel very disinclined to treat both extremes as equally unhelpful, then it's probably a sign that you haven't gone through the first two stages rigorously enough. This is at the heart of even-handedness and is central to its practice. Part of the recognition that's necessary here is that the content of an absolute claim, and whether it's negative or positive, makes very little difference. Very often, a positive absolute claim can easily be rephrased as a negative one that contradicts the negation. So it's really very much arbitrary. It's a question of whatever situation you happen to land in, whichever group you happen to adhere to, that creates the content of your absolute belief. It's not that it's preferable or more justified in itself compared to another one. That the precise content of metaphysical beliefs can have no effect on practical judgment is a point that's already been discussed in the What's Wrong with Metaphysics video earlier in this series. There we pointed out that the chief function of a metaphysical belief binds the individual to a group. It provides that group with an unconditional guarantee of loyalty, whereby the individual can't use their experience to question any of the supposed truths of the group. For that reason, when it comes to the individual making a practical judgment, the main point is that they're applying the judgment of the group. They're applying that absolutization, and they are not bringing to mind any alternatives which will rival the group's interpretation. It's thus completely arbitrary what the content of that claim is that the group happens to hold. As far as the individual is concerned, its main significance is to guarantee continued acceptance by the group. A lack of even-handedness is unfortunately evident in the skewed middle way found in traditional Buddhism. There, eternalism, which is a bundle of positive metaphysical beliefs put together, is generally considered to be preferable to nihilism, which involves a bundle of negative metaphysical beliefs. Eternalism is accompanied by absolute moral rules, which in traditional Buddhism are generally considered to be better than the relativism of moral rules, which you find in nihilism. This shows too much credence being given in traditional Buddhism to the content of metaphysical beliefs. The Buddha's critique of metaphysical beliefs here is being interpreted in a very limited way, which doesn't recognize the psychological function that metaphysics has, regardless of the circumstances, and that it doesn't depend on the content. Even if you think about the ways in which absolute moral rules and relativism of moral rules have practical effects, they don't really differ very much. Both of them are types of rigidity in which it may be appropriate in the circumstances, or because of a lack of flexibility which enable adaptation, it may not. Absolute moral rules may turn out to be the right ones in some circumstances, but those moral rules may turn out to be completely inadequate to others. So, for example, if you had an absolute moral rule never to eat fish, but fish was your only available food in a particular set of circumstances, then you'd be very likely to die out. Relativism of moral rules, however, has the advantage of a certain flexibility, even if it involves contextual limitation. So there's no attempt to look beyond that particular limited context where the moral rule applies appropriately. Another example of a lack of even-handedness that's particularly controversial in modern interpretations of the middle way is where it's appropriated by naturalists. By naturalists in this case, we mean those who adopt a naturalist metaphysics rather than just a scientific method for investigating things around us. And particularly here we'd be talking about phenomena which are very difficult to explain within a naturalist framework, where there may be competing supernaturalist and naturalist kind of ultimate explanations of what's going on. Let's say in the case of ghost sightings or near-death experiences. A naturalistic metaphysical interpretation may be skewed towards one side rather than another, on the grounds that a naturalist metaphysics is intrinsically more likely than a supernaturalist one. But in either case, it should be the evidence that determines the explanatory framework which we judge to be more likely. It's not the metaphysical explanation that we require in any case. The middle way can't be tilted towards one side or the other. Merely we need to avoid the metaphysics on either side and then judge according to what experience leads us with, even if that leaves us towards a kind of explanation that may be more associated with something like supernaturalism. Once we've identified extremes that are absolute opposites and treated them equally, then the fourth of my principles of even-handed judgment is to find a practical judgment that addresses conditions between those extremes. Even-handed use of the middle way doesn't provide us with an ultimate answer. but it does provide us with a space to look in. If we use the metaphor of navigating a strait, the middle way allows us to avoid the dangerous rocks on either side. However, it doesn't tell us exactly where to steer within the strait between the rocks. That's still to be determined on the basis of more immediate experience and judgment. As we enter into the particular practical demands of a particular situation, particular practical process, then it's much more likely that the little micro judgments we make within that process will be overwhelmingly determined by that practical context and by the goals we've already set ourselves. It's more likely that we'll enter into a process of reflection when bigger judgments are involved that frame the whole task or let us to reconsider what we should do next. So, to recap these 4 principles for even-handed judgment. First, we need to identify clear extremes of belief, not feeling or convention, but belief. We need to check that those beliefs are absolutes, that is, they can't be a matter of degree, and they're opposites that negate each other. Those are the beliefs we need to avoid in order to follow the middle way. Once we've begun to find that, we need to treat both extremes as equally unhelpful. If there seems to be a strong pressure either way, then we may need to reconsider the first 2 steps. Finally, our practical judgment is likely to be one that addresses conditions between the extremes. The middle way by itself won't dictate every single aspect of that judgment. However, it will help us to avoid the extremes on either side, which are likely to greatly impact the adequacy of our judgment.